so to make our friends, Mr. Tonym know everything. I'm very honored to play a guest to our to Tonym Abbottem, the Prime Minister of Australia, and very interesting person who is visiting Poland at the moment. Today we'll talk about three main topics: about immigration, about security, and climate change and energy. Since these topics are in our interest and are common in the interest of Poland and Australia. But for the moment, maybe we'll start with your free speech before we go to questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am very honoured to be here at this university, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here on a Sunday afternoon to discuss these very important subjects of immigration, of security, and of energy. Before we go to discussion, I thought I should say a little bit about me, a little bit about Australia, and a little bit about Poland as it looks from Australia. I was the 28th Prime Minister of Australia. I was the Prime Minister from September 2013 to September 2015. And in that time it was my honour to lead a government which controlled our borders, which repealed the carbon tax, and which did free trade deals with China, Japan and Korea. So obviously I have a very strong interest in secure borders. I have a very strong interest in energy policy, and I have a very strong interest in trying to promote the freest possible trade between countries. I came to politics, I suppose, from a background which many people in Poland would appreciate. I went to Catholic schools. I was educated by the Jesuits. In my days, the Jesuits had this saying that you should be a man for others. That the best thing you could do with your life was to try to make a difference, not for yourself, but for other people, and to leave the world a better place. And so, inspired by the Jesuits, at university I became a member of the Students' Representative Council. I then became a journalist. I then became a political staffer. I then became an advocate for an organisation called Australians for Constitutional Monarchy, which was defending the Crown in the Australian Constitution. I then went into Parliament as a member of the lower house. I was a senior minister in the Howard government before becoming leader of the opposition and then Prime Minister in 2013. So, a little bit about me. Australia. Australia is a wonderful country, you'd expect me to say that. But if I'm asked to describe Australia in a phrase, I say that we are a country with an Aboriginal heritage, a British foundation and a multicultural character. Australia was not empty when the British settled Australia in 1788. There were about 500,000, maybe 1 million Aboriginal people whose land it was. Their experience of British settlement was not a particularly happy one, but nevertheless we do today give great honour to the first Australians, and we want them to feel like they are first-class Australian citizens, despite the fact that there are still high levels of unemployment, high levels of early death, and serious social dysfunction amongst Indigenous people in our country. A British foundation, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, free speech, market capitalism. These have always characterised our country, and these are things that we inherited from Britain. A multicultural character. The first fleet, which came to Australia from Britain in 1788, included people of many different races and from many different countries, because even in the late 1700s, London was a very cosmopolitan city. So there were all sorts of people there, and all sorts of those people came to Australia on that first fleet and subsequently. After World War II, many people from Poland came to Australia. We now have something like 150,000 Australians of Polish extraction, and our ambassador here is in fact one of them, whose family, yes, take a bow, whose family came to Australia in 1981 as, if you like, solidarity refugees. But modern Australia, we think that about 40% of us were either born overseas or had a parent born overseas. So we are very much an immigrant country. But the great thing about the immigrants to Australia is that they have come not to change us, but to join us. And I think that's a very significant distinction. They've come not to change us, but to join us. And when I was Prime Minister, I used to say that it was important that all of us were part of Team Australia. Whatever our backgrounds, whatever our history, the idea was to become a first-class citizen of a great country which commanded your first and most important loyalty. Finally, just a little bit about Poland from an Australian perspective. We were all conscious, I think Australians are all conscious of the fact that back in 1939, what was then the British Empire went to war to protect Poland. Britain went to war because the guarantee that Britain had given to Poland was violated by the Germans and then by the Soviets. And we all know that the outcome of the Second World War, from Poland's perspective, was terribly unsatisfactory. Something like 6 million Poles were killed. Poland ended the war in the grip of the Soviet system and endured many years of oppression as part of the Soviet system. And yet one of the consequences of the war was Australian troops fighting side by side with the Free Polish Army in various theatres of war. Australian airmen fought with Poles as part of the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain and subsequently. At the Great Battle of Tobruk in 1942, the Poles and the Australians fought side by side. So through the tragedy of the Second World War, there was considerable contact between Australians and Poles. When I was a young student at Sydney University, I was conscious of the first stirrings of freedom here in Poland with the Solidarity movement, and Lech Wałęsa leaving the gates of the shipyard at Gdansk. I was very conscious of the influence of Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, and his role in lighting the torch of freedom, which started to shine throughout Eastern Europe and the wider world. I cheered, as I'm sure you all did, when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union broke up. Yes, it was a difficult transition, but certainly for Poland, it's been a transition that has been fundamentally for the good. I'm particularly conscious of how Poland has swiftly made a tradition from a totalitarian society to an open, liberal and largely free market society. It's a wonderful transition, and I have become in recent years conscious of the contrast between Poland and Ukraine, because as Prime Minister the MH17 atrocity brought me into close contact with the Ukraine's President Poroshenko and made me very familiar with the situation in that country. But what became obvious to me through my contacts with the Ukraine is that the Ukraine wants to be like Poland. They want to be like you. They want to be able to look west, if that's their choice. They want to enjoy the kind of prosperity and freedom that since 1990 you've increasingly been able to take for granted. Back in the Soviet days, the Ukraine and Poland were very similar in every sense. Roughly the same population, about 40 million people, roughly the same GDP. Today, Poland's gross domestic product is something like 5 times that of the Ukraine. That's partly, I suppose, the great cultural strength that Poland has, partly the fact that when Poland de-Sovietised the economy, you didn't just hand everything over to a bunch of oligarchs. You managed to do it so much better than it's been done in Russia, in Ukraine or in Belarus. But nevertheless, in so doing, you've provided an example, a living, breathing example of what a country like the Ukraine can aspire to. So it is a real pleasure to be here in Warsaw. This is my first ever trip to Poland. I want to thank all of you for making me so welcome. I hope I've given you just a few words of introduction. I hope I've whetted your appetite to want to travel to Australia at some stage. Certainly I find this country endlessly fascinating, and I hope this is not my last. Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us, Mr. Prime Minister. My first question to you would be a question that's probably commonly asked among Polish people when they see a foreigner coming to their country, is how do you find Poland so far? It is your first visit, you've said.
Well, so far so good, but I've only been here for 5 hours. I can vouch for the quality of the coffee shop at the Intercontinental Hotel. I can vouch for the sophistication of the gym, but I'm looking forward to a whole lot more over the next 48 hours.
You entered politics first big politics in 1994, when the first time you were elected to the Parliament, to the Australian Parliament. What pushed you to politics? Was there a person that inspired you?
Well, look, I think every would-be democratic politician in the Western world owes a great debt to Winston Churchill, the greatest British statesman, the greatest democratic politician of the 20th century, who led Britain through its darkest hour and was responsible for defeating Nazi tyranny and I think setting up in so many ways the fight against Soviet communism. Another great political mentor of mine was a famous Australian anti-communist by the name of b.Premierem, probably completely unknown here in Poland, but a person who inspired 2 or 3 generations of Catholics to take a close involvement in politics, not just to be people whose faith was a private thing, but people who were prepared to fight for good values in the public sphere as well. So B.A. Santamaria was a very significant figure in my life. Then, of course, our former Prime Minister, John Howard, who some of you might have heard of. John was our party leader for the first 15 years or so of my time in the Parliament. John has been one of the really great Australian Prime Ministers, arguably the best Prime Minister of the last 30 years. In fact, I think certainly the best Prime Minister of the last 30 years, and arguably the best Prime Minister we've ever had from my Liberal Party.
You said in your speech that you are a student of the Catholic school. You're a Catholic yourself, not a very common thing in England and in Australia. Why a Catholic school, and how has that school shaped you in your future political career?
Well, about 30% of the Australian population are Catholic. The Catholic percentage of the population has been increasing through immigration. 200 years ago, when we were a relatively new British colony, the majority of our people were Anglican or Church of England. There was always a significant Catholic percentage though, because a lot of Irish people came to Australia one way or another from the very beginning. But as I said, about 30% of our population are Catholic. As a youngster, I certainly took my faith very seriously. I still take it seriously. I can't claim to be a particularly good Catholic, but like all Catholics, I say, thank God for confession.
You were born in London, as you've mentioned. You're an immigrant yourself, going to Australia, later became Prime Minister. Do you think that if you stayed in England, would you get yourself to politics in England? Would it be easier, harder?
Well, it's interesting. I was a student at the University of Oxford for a couple of years, and while I was there, I did dabble in student politics. I was for one term the welfare officer for the Oxford University Student Union. I suspect if I'd stayed in England, I may well have become interested in British public life, but nevertheless I have always seen myself as an Australian. One of the reasons why I went back to Australia after my 2 years in Oxford was because I could feel I could feel the attraction of life in Britain, and I didn't want to succumb to it. I thought it was very important to leave before the place became too appealing.
England and Australia are both members of the monarchy,
Yes.
and you said that you're a member of the Australians for constitutional monarchy. Why defend monarchy? Why sort of preserve it in Australia?
Okay, well, constitutional monarchy is a very good system of government. It is a very, very good system of government. The monarchy in Australia is quite different from the monarchy in Britain, even though in both cases the monarch is the same, Queen Elizabeth II. But in our country, the monarch is represented by a Governor-General. The Governor-General is appointed by the government of the day. But the Governor-General is not a politician, not elected, more like a judge, if you like. But the fact that the Governor-General represents the Crown gives that person a status, an authority, a mystique almost, which a mere judge or an elected politician wouldn't have. It's difficult to explain to those who aren't familiar with it, but it's a system which has worked very well for us. It's a system that has worked very well for us, and history and tradition and the various twists and turns of our national life have ended up giving us, in our Australian version of the constitutional monarchy, a system which I think is far better than anything you would be able to devise if you were starting with a pencil and paper and trying to work it out from scratch. So it's a great system, and being of a conservative disposition, being of a conservative instinct, my view is you don't change things that have stood the test of time unless there's a very good reason to do so. And I can see no good reasons to change a constitutional arrangement which has worked so wonderfully well for our country for the best part of 220 years.
But if you had to choose between the English political scene and the Australian political scene, do you see big differences between those two? Or that monarchy united?
Well, look, Britain is a very comparable country and comparable society. When I went from Australia to England in 1981, when I went from Sydney University to Oxford University, when I went from the Sydney University Rugby Union Club to the Oxford University Rugby Union Club, it was almost a seamless transition. I can remember on the Saturday evening of my first rugby game for Oxford, going to a terrace house in the Iffley Road of Oxford, and thinking to myself, I may well have been in a terrace house in Cleveland Street in Sydney. Same architecture, same sorts of people, even singing the same sorts of songs after the game. I guess the beer was better in Australia than it was in England, but that was the only real difference. So look, Britain and Australia are very comparable countries. Nevertheless, there are some differences in the polity. As you all know, since 1972, I think, Britain has been a member of the European Union, or what is now the European Union. Last year, Britain voted to leave the European Union. I think that's going to be good for Britain. May not be good for Europe, but it'll certainly be good for Britain. That, in a sense, will make Britain more comparable to Australia, in a sense, because there'll be no supranational body to which Britain is accountable.
Would you recommend for other members of the European Union to follow the UK?
Well, this is a very good question. To whom is your loyalty? Do you feel like Europeans? Do you feel like Poles? This is the fundamental question. And if first and foremost you're Poles, you should only be in the European Union if you think that is beneficial for your national interest. If first and foremost you're Europeans, well, maybe be in the European Union regardless of whether it's good or bad for Poland. But my instinct is that for most of the countries of Europe, for most of the people of Europe, their first loyalty is to the nation rather than to the continent. That's my instinct. Certainly, most Britons feel first and foremost British, or perhaps Scottish, or Welsh, or English, or Irish. I think these tend to be the loci of loyalty for people, and if your first loyalty is to your country, you should join international bodies if and only if it's in your country's interests.
Right, so when we are talking about the European Union, you said that Australia was built by immigrants, and you're an immigrant yourself, but I'd like to ask you, what is your view on the current immigration crisis that is right now happening to the Western world?
Okay, well, first point to make is that I can absolutely understand why someone in Syria or Libya or Iran or Iraq or Nigeria would want to live in Europe? Why wouldn't you want to leave a country that is poor, violent, and with what looks like a limited future, to live in a place which is peaceful, which is prosperous, and which has a generous social security system? Why wouldn't you want to leave if you thought you could? So I don't feel antagonistic towards the people who want to migrate to a Western country. Not at all. I absolutely understand why they want to do it. But I think that all of us have a duty to our own people and to our own citizens, and we abandon that duty if we pursue policies or allow policies that will radically change the nature of our own countries. We have a right and indeed a duty to keep our character, and uncontrolled migration, particularly uncontrolled migration from places that are very different from our own, will over time fundamentally change our countries and our societies, and we are under no obligation to accept that. So I think these two principles are very important. Each country has a right and a duty to control its borders. Each country has a right and a duty to keep its character. And what we need to understand is that once someone is out of a war zone and they want to keep moving, in my judgment, they're no longer refugees, they're would-be economic migrants. I mean, if you take the Syria war zone, if you want to be safe, you go to Jordan, you go to Turkey, you go to Lebanon. You may not be well off, but you're safe. But once you go beyond Turkey, beyond Lebanon, beyond Jordan, you are no longer a refugee, you are an economic migrant. Now, by all means, if that's what you want, pursue that. But countries are not obliged to take everyone who arrives on their doorstep and says, I want in.
Your government introduced the project Operation Solid Borders during your 2 years in government. Do you think it had fulfilled its purposes as intended?
Well, absolutely it has. We had our own border protection crisis. It was on a much smaller scale than the problems facing Europe, but nevertheless we had our own version of it under the former government, the government that I replaced. Back in July of 2013, we had illegal arrivals by boat running at the rate of about 50,000 a year, and numbers have been steadily building up because the former government had the view that essentially if you could get here, you could stay here. I took the view that that was dead wrong. And as long as people thought if they could get here, they could stay here, they would come in ever-increasing numbers, and there were potentially hundreds of thousands, even millions, who might be tempted to make the trip to Australia if they thought it would result in permanent residency and ultimately citizenship. So we said, first, if you get here to Australia, there's no guarantee of permanent residency. We'll give you what we call temporary protection visas. Second, if we pick you up at sea, you won't come to Australia, you'll come in the first instance to an offshore island such as Manus, which is part of Papua New Guinea, or Nauru, which is a small independent country in the Pacific. And third, if we could, we would turn the boat around to Wenset came. So about 30 illegal boats were turned back to Indonesia, from which most of them had come. And where the people smugglers scuttled their boats, which was their tactic, we defeated that by providing the people on the boat with an alternative. We bought these big orange life rafts, and the life rafts were on Australian naval vessels, and where boats were scuttled, we put their occupants in the life rafts and sent them back to Indonesia. It worked.
Simple measures. Well, I think that it's wrong not to mention, when we talk about immigration, it's wrong not to mention Donald Trump. What is your opinion on his policies towards immigration? Do you think it's something we should follow? Well, Australia doesn't, but Europe does need to follow.
Well, I think it would be a big mistake not to give the new American president a fair go. The President of the United States is, to all intents and purposes, the leader of the free world. It's in all our interests that the President succeed, because it's in all our interests that America be strong and successful. And for all the occasional problems with American leadership, a world without American leadership would be a much rougher, worse place than a world with American leadership. That's not to say that American leadership is always and everywhere absolutely perfect. We can all think of different things that America has done in recent times that, with the wisdom of hindsight, might have been done differently or better. Nevertheless, the thing about America is that it has the strength and the goodwill to be, in effect, the world's policeman. So I think we should do our best to support as best we can the new American government. There are some things that the new American government is proposing to do which are entirely orthodox: to cut taxes, to build infrastructure, to boost defence. These are orthodox centre-right positions. As for the build a wall policy, well, what President Trump is proposing is to maintain a secure border with Mexico. There are all sorts of reasons why that's arguably a sensible policy. There are a lot of illegal immigrants in the United States. There are all sorts of issues associated with illegal immigration. One, at least, is the pressure that illegal immigrants put on the labour market. One of the reasons why there is such discontent in America right now is that for ordinary workers, real wages haven't increased in at least a couple of decades. And one of the factors, not the only factor in that, is pressure from immigration. So whether you agree with Donald Trump's policies or disagree with Donald Trump's policies, I think you can make a case for most of them.
In one of the interviews you've said that by curbing the immigration, it would be a solution to the problem of housing in Australia, which is a rise, at least a year ago it was. How would that help?
Well, there is no total solution, simple total solution to any complex issue. But nevertheless, if you are adding 200,000 or 300,000 people a year, they've all got to be housed, and that is adding to the demand for housing, and inevitably that is adding to the price pressures on housing. Now, it's not the only factor by any means, but one of the very few things that the federal government, the national government in Australia, can do to take the pressure off housing prices is adjust the rate of immigration. There are all sorts of other things that you can do in terms of housing prices. You can boost the supply of land, you can expedite approvals for construction, but they are things that would have to be done by different levels of government, state governments or local governments. So my proposal to scale back the rate of immigration, at least until land supply and infrastructure catches up, is one measure that the federal government could take to make housing more affordable. Just on the general subject of immigration, I stress Australia is an immigrant society. We always have been, we always will be. I am in favour of immigration, but just because you are in favour of immigration doesn't mean that every year you have to have more immigrants than the year before.
Your government, one of the first bills of your government was to repeal the carbon tax that was introduced earlier, and that was a part of a different approach to environmental protection, a direct action, as your government has described it. Could you say something more about that?
Okay, well, I should say that I regard climate change as a significant issue, but it's by no means the most important issue that our world faces. In a country like Poland, you've got obviously the ongoing challenge of prosperity, and in recent times you've got issues of security as well. And I think it's important that we should have strong and effective policies to deal with climate change, but it would be a big mistake, in my judgment, to put in place policies which damage the economy in the name of environmental protection, particularly protection against a threat which is speculative in some senses, and certainly very gradual, because we don't want to do too much damage today in order to avert something that might or might not happen tomorrow. So, as I said, climate change is an important issue, but it's by no means the most significant challenge that our world faces. I regret that so much of the discussion about climate change has become theological. It's almost had religious overtones. I think that we need to be very hard-headed and genuinely scientific about this, and we need to look at the facts as well as the theory, and when the facts don't fit the theory, we change the theory rather than trying to fiddle the facts to make them fit the theory. So I thought that rather than clobber the economy with a great big new tax on everything, there were much less expensive and more effective ways of reducing emissions. And interestingly, partly through standard market forces and partly through the kind of incentives that we've introduced under our direct action policy, we are well on track to beat our 2020 targets for emissions reductions, and we think without any significant economic dislocation we can meet our Paris targets of a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions. Interestingly, over the last 20 years, long before anyone thought of a carbon tax, Australia's emissions intensity has reduced by about 50% because people have done very sensible things, like turned off the lights when they're not being used, try to make heating and cooling systems more efficient, tried to drive trucks more efficiently and effectively without keeping your foot on the gas. So ordinary market forces have been very effective at reducing our use of expensive fossil fuels, and frankly, the market is probably our best hope when it comes to ensuring that we do the right thing by the environment.
And so introducing, for example, by European Union, introducing limits on CO2 emission is not the way.
Well, I don't want to give, one of the things I learned as Prime Minister was be careful about giving advice to other governments, because if you're too free with your advice to them, they'll start giving their advice to you, and it might not be good for anyone. But this is not advice, this is an observation. Europe has certainly reduced its emissions, but it's also transferred much of its manufacturing industry to countries that haven't reduced their emissions. What we have seen over the last generation is the migration of much heavy industry from Europe to Asia. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, because as countries advance and progress, there will be a lesser reliance on manufacturing and a greater reliance on services, and services are less emissions intensive than manufacturing. But nevertheless, a factory in Europe is nearly always going to be much more environmentally conscious than a factory in the third world. So let's not be too smug about things that have improved our environmental outcomes, but which may not have made that much environmental difference, because these bad environmental outcomes have gone from one country to another rather than being ended.
Your government has also introduced a turn in foreign policy, beginning our slogan, Les Geneva More Jakarta, was present. Why such a turn from the West to the regional partners, neighbours?
Okay, well, under my government, Australia certainly didn't abandon our commitments to the American alliance. We didn't abandon our role, our global role in support of Western liberal values, far from it. But I also think that it's important to focus your efforts on where you can make the most difference, and plainly, Australia can make more difference close at home than we can far afield. Now, that's not to say that Australia can't make a difference globally. Under my government, we were the second largest contributor after the Americans to the coalition against ISIS or Daesh in the Middle East. When MH17 was shot down by Russian-backed rebels over the eastern Ukraine, we certainly did our best to make our presence felt, and we weren't going to tolerate for a second that kind of atrocity if we could help it. So Australia is a country with some global reach, because we've certainly got global interests, and I believe that we stand for universal values. But nevertheless, sensible countries focus their efforts where they can make the most difference, and plainly our arm, while long, is stronger closer to home.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry for such a short lecture, because Tonym has a very tight schedule and we must finish. Also, we take some photos after the lecture. And Tonym, thank you for that this first time in Poland. The first stop in Poland was university, and your meeting with students. And we hope that we'll get more occasions to meet in the future. Thank you all for this attendance, which is enormous for us, and we thought that thanks to that we think that will make more such occasions to meet. And this